In this video, I will be performing the suite in E minor by Jean-Nicolas Geoffroy. The suite has a total of 11 movements, out of which I have selected the following 7: Allemande, Courante, Sarabande, Gavotte, Menuet, Gigue, and Chaconne. My decision to present a selection of movements has to do with how Geoffroy's works have come down to us. As I have mentioned in previous videos, all of his harpsichord works survive in a single manuscript compiled after his death by an unknown copyist. And while I do not have definitive proof, my suspicion is that the copyist decided to group together all, or in some cases most, of the pieces in a particular tonality that were available to him. This would explain why, for instance, a suite in A minor has a total of 7 gavottes. I've also mentioned before that a significant percentage of pieces or entire suites appear in more than one tonality. This is the case with 2 of the movements of the E minor suite. The rondeau, which I did not include in my selection, also appears as part of the suite in C minor, and the chaconne also appears in D minor. Taking all these factors into consideration, I tend to think that the suites we find in the manuscript may have more to do with the copyist's choices and do not necessarily reflect Geoffroy's intentions. Of course, I cannot claim that my selection reflects his intentions in any way either, but my aim was to present those movements that, obviously in my opinion, add up to a coherent work. I have discussed some of the distinctive features of Geoffroy's harmonic style in previous videos. Needless to say, these features are also present in the E minor suite, and I do want to highlight some of the more memorable ones. However, another aspect I would like to discuss involves certain stylistic similarities between various movements of the same dance type. In other words, there are certain figurations or even rhythmic gestures that appear in, say, many of his Allemandes, his Sarabandes, etc., although they're always slightly reconfigured from movement to movement. Let's start with the Allemande. From the opening measures, we encounter a harmonic device that is present in many of Geoffroy's works. The juxtaposition between a regular note and its chromatic alteration. And within the context of this particular Allemande, this means the juxtaposition between C and C sharp and D sharp. The use of chromatic alterations is certainly not unique to Geoffroy, and we find it in a lot of 17th century repertory. What makes it perhaps more instantly recognizable in his works is that he tends to use it in ways that make it stand out. In this particular Allemande, for instance, we're frequently dealing with double chromatic alterations, since both pitches C and D may be involved almost simultaneously. Let's look at it in a little more detail. First of all, it's important to keep in mind that in the key of E minor, the notes C and D are the 6th and 7th degrees of the scale. So from our modern perspective, having these notes appear as natural or chromatically altered means we are getting different versions of the minor scale, and especially the natural and the melodic form. Of course, Geoffroy would not have been thinking exactly in those terms. However, we can translate the effect using modern music theory and still appreciate the delicious chromatic twists it produces. So let me show you what I mean by this. I want to play the opening measures of this for a moment, and then I will explain what I'm talking about. Okay, now what I mean by these chromatic alterations is this. If we go back to the very beginning and we look at the right hand, we have this melody. In other words, D sharp, C sharp, and then immediately D natural and C natural. And we're going to find the same thing immediately in the left hand, because this melody, if we continue, we have this very nice imitation between what we heard in the right hand and now this is imitated in the left hand. So this piece is really full of all of these intricate details. So we get this kind of double alteration, chromatic alteration, both in the right hand and the left hand. And then if we continue, we find similar things happening throughout the piece. So if I kind of continue from where I left off, I start with a C natural in the left hand, and then immediately I have a C sharp in the right hand. And again, if I continue from there, notice that now I have stopped here. I have a D sharp, and immediately there is a D natural. So these are happening very, very fast. And within that moment, we also get another chromatic alteration between C and C sharp. So C sharp, C natural. So this kind of juxtaposition continues throughout this Allemande, and as I said, what makes it so distinctive is not that he's the only one that does it, but he does it so prominently and he does it to such a great extent. This Allemande also contains a rhythmic gesture we find in other Allemandes by Geoffroy. It involves the presence of a dramatic pause between the first and second beats of a measure, which is created by the first beat consisting of only one chord, which is either prolonged into the second beat or followed by rest at the beginning of the second beat. And you've heard this already when I played the beginning, because it happens twice. So let me play again, and I will show you exactly where it is. I will kind of over-dramatize that moment. There was one there. Excuse me. So in other words, we have one in each one of these measures. There's this one. And then the next measure. So, and excuse me for that tiny mistake I made. It was the excitement of the moment. So what is happening is that the same gesture is going to appear, for instance, in one of the Allemandes of the suite in C minor. And I'm using the suite in C minor simply because I have recorded it in the past, and I will put a link in the video description of that video. So if we go for a moment to the C minor suite, we're going to find the same thing. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start playing it, and I'm going to again over dramatize what happens at that moment. It happens in the third full measure of this Allemande. So again, when we reach this chord, rest, and we go on. It's not the only example in this Allemande, but I'm just playing this one instance so you see what is happening. The E minor Allemande also shares a feature with other movements of the E minor suite. It occurs at some point in time during the second section and involves the melodic line gradually ascending until it reaches the highest C of the harpsichord. We have two instances of this kind of, let's say, soaring melody in the second section of the Allemande. The first occurs near the beginning of the second section, with the melody progressively rising higher until it reaches a high B, and then a couple of measures later it's going to soar even higher to a C. Let me go back to the E minor Allemande, and I'm going to start the second section, and again notice how the melody is going to soar higher and higher. Here is the B, another B here, now we're going to have a couple of measures of a little repose. Except this chord is absolutely beautiful. Okay. So now we keep going. And here's the C. So it's right there, we go, finally we reach that high C of the harpsichord. The same strategic placing of this high C towards the end of the second section occurs in the next three movements. In other words, the Courante, the Sarabande, and the Gavotte. Let me show you for a moment how it occurs in the Courante and the Gavotte, and I'll discuss the Sarabande afterwards because there are a couple of other features in that movement I would also like to talk about. So if for a moment we go to the Courante, again this is going to be in the second section towards the end. So we reach the high C there, and again if we go to the Gavotte, there's a C, and that's the end of the piece. So a lot of these occur very, very near the end. Let's turn now to the Sarabande, and let me get to that page. The first feature of this piece I would like to point out has to do with a chromatic gesture we also find in other sarabandes by Geoffroy. More specifically, there is a chromatic descent in the inner and lower voice at the very beginning of the second section. So I'm talking about this particular one. So the left hand is doing this. And we find a very similar chromatic descent in the Sarabande of the C minor suite, which, interestingly enough, also occurs at the very beginning of its second section. So in the C minor suite, we have the beginning of the second section sounds like this. So the left hand is doing this. And of course, this is very, very similar to what was happening in the E minor suite. The second feature involves the soaring melody I mentioned previously. What is specifically noteworthy here is how Geoffroy builds up expressive tension along the journey to that high C. We have units of 2 measures each, and each unit begins with an approach by an interval of a fourth to a progressively higher note, meaning we gradually ascend from G to A to B and finally to C. In other words, we have this, and notice what's going to happen in the right hand. Again, the melody. We're going to start. So here's the fourth that I mentioned, this instance going from D to G. Here's now the second unit. We go to A. Here's the third unit. Now we're going to go up to B. And finally the C. And the expressive tension is further intensified by the accompanied harmonies. You probably heard that. And especially one of Geoffroy's trademark ninth chords built on F sharp. It's this one here. That entire measure has this chord here. It's an F sharp chord that's going to end up in B major. So again, harmonically it makes sense, but it's this ninth chord. He has given it this quality that makes it more tense than just a regular chord. Finally, let's look at the Chaconne. It is cast in the typical form of many 17th century French chaconnes, which is rondo form. That is, we have a refrain alternating with contrasting sections. These contrasting sections are usually referred to as couplets, but as you will see when following the score during the performance, in the score, the refrain itself is labeled as the first couplet, which means that the first contrasting section is labeled as the second couplet, and so on. Just to avoid confusion, I will use modern terminology and refer to the refrain as the refrain, and call everything else a couplet. The bass line of the refrain outlines what we call a circle of fifths progression. Here's the refrain. And this is the bass line by itself. words, a circle of fifths progression is. In addition to the circle of fifths, another feature of the bass line is a gradual stepwise descent. So yes, I'm doing this, but this is also descending. I mention this because descending bass lines usually feature prominently in Geoffroy's chaconnes. And even if this is a more indirect way of stating a descending bass line, it prepares the ground for the much longer stepwise descent that occurs in the last couplet. Another feature of the refrain, which is typical of Geoffroy's harmonic language, is the use of chords that are richer than simple triads. In other words, in the music of Geoffroy, we frequently find seventh, ninth, and even more extended chords that gives his music a jazzy character, since these chords are also very characteristic of jazz. In the refrain, we find simple triads alternating with seventh chords. However, Geoffroy emphasizes the seventh chords by placing them on the first beat of each measure. And what I mean by this is we start, and here's the seventh chord. And then we end there. So all of these chords that we see at the beginning are all seventh chords. My favorite extended chord in the entire chaconne occurs near the beginning of the fourth couplet. And it's this one here. So it's this one. It's a dominant minor ninth, which resolves normally to A major. In other words, it's this one that resolves to A major. But what makes this chord so delicious and so daring is that Geoffroy has arranged the notes so that E and F are next to each other and thus produce a deliberate clash. So you actually hear this, in other words, because E and F are right here. The last couplet is quite fascinating for a couple of reasons. First, the bass line incorporates both a stepwise descent spanning an entire octave, as well as two statements of the circle of fifths progression found in the refrain. Let me play the fifth couplet here, the last couplet, and I want you to pay attention to the left hand, and I'm also going to play this a little more slowly and kind of show you what I'm doing. So we start, and the left hand plays an E. Now we go down to D, C, B, and we keep going down. And at that point, the left hand is now going to switch to the circle of fifths progression that we heard before. So I had stopped here. And then we're going to hear it one more time, this circle of fifths progression. But the second fascinating aspect is what I just played and involves the remarkable sonorities during the second statement of the circle of fifths progression, And I call them remarkable because this series of extended chords evoke a soundscape that is pretty much identical to jazz. And I mean this. So as I've said before, it's almost sometimes as if Geoffroy had somehow managed to travel to the 20th century and take some harmony lessons from Thelonious Monk, because some of these chords and then clashes like this one, these are very, very characteristic of 20th century jazz and really go far beyond, at least to my knowledge, the kinds of harmonies that you find in music of the 17th century. And to me, this is what makes Geoffroy's music in general so unique and so distinctive. He's really willing to take risks that, as far as I know again, no other composer was willing to take. And if they did feature them, they did not feature them in such a prominent way. As always, thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoy the performance.